This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. Through their diverse range of publications, New Society Publishers' books explore topics that are at the forefront of creating positive change in our world. From regenerative agriculture and permaculture to social justice and eco-conscious living, their books cover a wide spectrum of subjects that empower readers to lead more regenerative and fulfilling lives. Now, whether you're a seasoned environmentalist, a curious beginner, or someone simply seeking inspiration and guidance on your journey towards regenerative living, New Society Publishers is here to support you every step of the way. Now exclusively for listeners of this podcast, you can use the code SKILLS25 and receive a 25% discount on all ebooks at newsociety.com. That's all one word and lowercase, SKILLS25 on all ebooks. So level up your knowledge today at newsociety.com. Hey there everybody and welcome back. So much of the conversation around water revolves around its scarcity. But today we're going to get a chance to explore how to manage water regeneratively when the challenge is having too much water. As arid zones become drier, the opposite is proving true for humid zones. The North American eastern seaboard is looking like an emblematic case of this. As storms become stronger and charged with massive evaporation from warmer temperatures and a warmer ocean, flooding, erosion, and saturation are becoming bigger issues in this area. Coastlines as well are struggling with these issues, as well as the degradation of their delicate vegetation and poorly applied gray infrastructure. So to get a better understanding of these ecological challenges, I reached out to a good friend, Mike Lynn. Now, Mike is an ecological designer with United Designers International, and owner of Eastern Ecosystems. He has worked on numerous projects around the world, including large-scale watershed restoration, agricultural and agroforestry production systems, and ecological restoration. Around the Chesapeake Bay in the U.S., he works with stormwater management, ecological restoration, and living shorelines projects. With a passion for education, Mike also provides training for a wide array of audiences. Now, in this episode, we'll not only explore Mike's fascinating background and path to ecological design, we'll take the time to focus on evolving challenges of water management when safe drainage and removal of excess water is the objective over retention and capture. So instead of giving anything away, I'll hand things over now to Mike Lynn. So, Mike, I'm thrilled to have you here today, partly because I have been wanting to get you on the podcast due to the quality of conversations that you and I have been having for well over a year at this point, and most of it being around some of the back-end work of United Designers International, as well as getting to know more about your projects and your own work. And sometimes this is fun because from the interviewer perspective, I get to ask you questions that are probably awkward at this stage of us knowing each other to go back into your history under a different circumstance. So why don't we start with that? Can you tell me a bit about your background and how you got into ecological work?
Fantastic. Well, I am also excited to be here and thank you for the invite. I've enjoyed our conversation. So yes, looking forward to seeing how this one goes. So I would say about, at this point, 15 years ago, I had been looking at the state of our ecosystems and the state of our planet and wondering what I could do. And I came across permaculture. And so like many stories go with that, I won't, go into the weeds with the details, but took my first PDC and then got hooked, took another one because I felt, okay, that was great. I, learned just enough to be dangerous. Not, that maybe not a fair assumption or a fair assessment, but I learned enough to say, I need to know more. So I took another one because I wanted a different perspective and it grew from there. So around those first couple years, I would, work on my own project. I owned a little bit of land, so I'd try different things out there. And then I'd, of course, nerd out with my friends and family on it. And they're like, oh, I'm interested in this. Well, what would you recommend here? So friends and family design kind of thing. And then that grew into other people's places, doing a little bit of education because I have a background a little bit with education. And so what little bit, here's what I know. Let me share it with the folks that I can. Started growing into a bit larger projects, some farms, that kind of thing. And yeah, it sort of snowballed from there. And now I am very fortunate enough to be where I'm at and working with United Design. I have my own company that does ecological design and some consultants, some education. And then I also am on the team with UDI, which, for those not familiar with, we do United Designers International. We work on projects. It's a co-op of designers around the world that's sometimes, we all have our own projects, but we also share and collaborate on some larger scale projects.
Now, I know that that's something that so many of the designers in UDI, as well as a lot of the people that I have interviewed, have in common of permaculture being their window in. And as much as I've had gripes and criticisms of the permaculture movement and community in the past, I am also part of that club. I mean, it's been such a window for so many people to get into all of the possibilities of how to work productively with ecosystems and do something as an alternative. But at the same time, I also know that you glossed over a lot of very interesting jobs that you had before getting into UDI and Eastern Ecosystems, your company. Start back a bit from there, because I really like the perspective of these very diverse backgrounds of people who come into this and bring unique skill sets and experiences that often bring a ton of value into this space.
Okay. So yes, well, it all started back when I was 3 years old, Oliver. No, I'm joking. The Early on when I was a kid, my father did a lot of construction work. So I worked with construction growing up. I was, around it, worked on it. Matter of fact, the statute of limitations on child labor laws has now run out. So I can say my dad would be like, hey, you want to go to school today, or do you want to go put on a roof? And for me, skipping school to get out in the sun and hang out with my father, fantastic. So I was around construction a lot, which plays back into the story later on. And then, owned some property which required that skill set. So not only new construction, but construction that had been, renovation, that type of thing, remodeling. And then with public safety back in 2001, early of 2001, I graduated college and decided to become a firefighter. And so I work in the Washington, D.C. area as a firefighter since 2001. And that's, I don't know if you've known many firefighters, it is how we say the best part-time, full-time job you can have, because we would do 24-hour shifts. I could do a lot of time. I'd have 10 days a month that I had to be at the fire station, 20 days a month that I didn't. So that lent itself to a lot of folks do construction work or do have a side business. And mine went into ecological design. So like I said, about 15 years ago is when I started doing more and more design. But I also felt like I didn't really know enough yet to market myself as a designer. So I would do, the friends and family, the farms, do some education. But through my work with the fire department, I had come across some issues with human trafficking. I had volunteered as part of a nonprofit that was doing some work in the space to help them out with an event. And as I learned what human trafficking was, I had always gotten the impression that it looked like the movie Taken, for those that are familiar with that movie. Yeah. And that does exist. That absolutely does exist, but it's far more insidious a lot of times, and it's hidden in plain sight. And so as I learned what human trafficking often really looks like, not that Taken does not happen, it does, but far more often, at least in our area, it looks very different. It looks like drug abuse. It looks like prostitution. It looks like many other things, but it actually is human trafficking is what perpetuated that and what instigated that. And so as I look back upon my own career, I realized, man, there's calls that I've run that I thought it was, an addiction issue, or I thought it was prostitution that led to whatever incident that we were called for as an emergency service. And then realized, oh no, that was probably human trafficking. I just didn't know none of us knew what we were looking at. So I went looking for a program for our fire and EMS people to be able to learn about this. There really wasn't one at that time. So I connected with some subject matter experts that were on a task force. We developed one. And so for quite a while then, because I had some background with teaching some fire classes for some colleges around where I lived, I had some experience with educational program development for that. And so we developed one for this, and that kind of snowballed into more. And so for some time I was quite involved, and still am ancillary. I still deliver some training to fire EMS, but I've less so of the general audiences, but did a lot of educational on that. And that was kind of until while that was going on, I was also educating more and more, did a graduate certificate in ecological restoration, did some other training that's not so much, to kind of get that skill set and knowledge base up to where, okay, now I am ready to market myself as a designer. And that kind of coincided with my involvement with the education on the trafficking dropping off, where this was starting to ramp up. And that was, let's see, probably somewhere between 5-10 years ago,
Yeah.
around that period where that transitioned. And yeah, I would say 5 to 7, where I really started doing a lot more design work. And then as time progressed, that design work grew from, smaller scale, smaller farms to larger and larger projects.
So, from that seemingly very unrelated background in construction and then firefighting and then working in task forces with human trafficking, how have your experiences from that and the knowledge that you built from that sector translated into a skill set that's useful for you in working with ecosystems?
Oh, yes. Thank you for reminding me. I did say I would circle back on that, didn't I? So working with ecological design, as you look at permaculture and that kind of thing, which again, I'm not disparaging permaculture, there are some components there that I feel sometimes get lost or glossed over or just not touched on. But with the built environment, you can't just separate the ecological systems with the built environment. So understanding that, and yeah, it would be great if we could just kind of hit the reset button and build all of our buildings to be energy friendly and not using toxic materials and all that. But the truth of the matter is that we live in the world we live, and this is what we have to work with. This is the hand we're dealt. So how can we make the best of what we have? So incorporating ecological design, yes, doing the landscape, and I worked, as you know, and we've had many conversations on with the water, but also the built environment is something that is not often talked about. So the construction really lent itself for me to understanding how buildings work, and not only how they work, but where the weak points are, where the leverage and inflection points that we can actually make a difference, not just in the landscape, but also in the building environment as far as efficiency of energy usage. Can we do passive solar with this? Can we renovate this in a way that a little bit will save not only in energy costs, but reduce, water usage, all of the resources that we're trying to promote and manage and steward by landscape management? How do we do that with the built environment? So incorporating the two of them with the other components, I mean, it gives me the opportunity to, I've interacted and dealt with every single cross section of society. And that has helped me not only, how do I articulate that? It's helped me understand on how to engage with people wherever they might be. And with the trafficking side of things, it also gave me the perspective that there's a lot of things that I don't understand, having not experienced myself. And with social justice and these components, I do a little bit of work with some nonprofits in this area, doing some grant review, that type of thing. And so where these areas of vulnerability for trafficking are often, underserved areas. So in terms of restoration or ecological design, these areas are also typically vulnerable for ecological degradation. And in a lot of these areas, if we tip that balance, if we as designers can work with the stakeholders, work with the land stewards, work with these communities in a way that promotes resilience, that promotes a balanced ecology with, and having the economic opportunities, we'll see the issues with vulnerability to trafficking. We'll see that vulnerability drop down as these communities build up their self-sufficiency, self-reliance, the resilience, the reliance, not lack of reliance on outside resources,
Yeah.
where then that reduces that vulnerability. So it's a win-win across the board. And for me as a designer, being able to be a part of that, and in whatever way I'm able to work in that space to help those communities, is just very, very rewarding for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the reason why you and I have connected so much, because I also got into ecological design through building. I didn't spend nearly as much time in commercial building. I went into natural building pretty quickly. But the idea of designing and thinking about the function of the zone zero, the built environment first, and then going out from there rather than starting with landscape and then considering the built environment has been really interesting. And so beyond that, I'm really curious about, first of all, the unique challenges that you guys have over on the East Coast. It's one of the parts of the United States that I've spent the least amount of time in. I've grew up mostly in the Midwest, and then a lot of my work later was in the Western states and the Southwest. Tell me about what you guys are facing over there. I know that there's been a lot more rainfall. There's been some big storms and hurricanes that have even come up that far. What are the challenges that you're facing and that you're starting to work to build resilience against?
That's a great question. So a lot of the places, as you know, that we work tend to be arid, semi-arid, that type of thing. So managing the water because we have too little water is the
Yes.
challenges in a lot of the areas that we work with ecological design. We on this coast in some areas have the opposite problem where we have so much water and it comes at times at intervals that are incredibly, we get the deluge, we get these big storms, like you said, hurricanes, not just hurricanes, but we're getting major weather events, these 100-year storms in some areas in the East Coast. We're seeing those maybe every 10, 20 years now, these 100-year storm events. So how do we design for that? And one of the resume items that I left off there was stormwater management. So
Oh, yeah.
where we're trying to capture on these semi-arid, arid environments and these things, we still try to capture water because we'll have periods of dry and we'll have periods of drought on the East Coast. But what do we do when we have so much water that the landscape can't handle it? How do we manage the stormwater runoff? So I do work with my own, but also with some of the NGOs in this area with stormwater management, because that's a big issue here. We have, leads to a lot of erosion problems, leads to water quality. I live very close to the Chesapeake Bay, and it's this huge estuarine system that was just ecologically degraded, horribly degraded over the last century or two, just with all the industry and land use change and everything else. And now that we have more and more impervious cover in the watershed, this watershed is, I think, it's been a little while since I remember, I think it's about 64,000 square mile, and I think, what is that, about 160,000 square kilometer. So huge watershed,
Yeah.
but it's also there's a lot of land use change. So it went from forestry to agriculture, and now is going to the built environment, a lot of impervious cover. So how do we manage the stormwater here to reduce the nutrient loads, the sediment loads, the pollution that runs off into the water, and at the same time can we get it to soak in, sink in like we would in the other environments and the other climates for those periods of without rain, for those dry periods, those droughts that sometimes do occur, especially because as weather patterns shift, then we're still forested in some of this area, but as it dries out, an ecosystem that's typically longer periods of water, not used to these more and more frequent periods of dry, that now we risk forest fires. And as you know, the folks that are in arid and semi-arid environments are far more used to that. We're starting to learn here is an issue. So how do we do that? And then just how do we be good stewards of that water? That we pump a lot of groundwater here that we don't have to if we learn to manage it better. And so, yes, that stormwater management is a big part of my role here in my own backyard, so to speak.
Yeah, it's been a
That's one of
long
the
time.
problems. One of the other,
No,
oh,
sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I didn't mean to talk over there.
No, no, no. There's a little
One
bit
of
of
the other
floor.
issues, one of the other issues we have here is coastal erosion. So one of the things that you and I have chatted about recently, and that I'm really nerding out on as of late, is living shoreline. So there's obvious with the dune systems and that you have on the maritime, the seaside coast are one side, but when you get into this estuarine system where it's still tidal, still it doesn't necessarily have to be salty, but still tidal, we're getting significant erosion here because one, we're already seeing some sea level rise. And the projected sea level rise over, I heard a recent estimate here where I'm at, There's an estimated 1.7 feet expected by the end of the mid-century this century to the beginning of the next century. And that's a lot. We're very low. We're a very flat land area, coastal plain. And we also have significant wind events, rain events, storm events. There was a living shoreline that was installed here, not my project, but very close to where I live, that the 2 years from when they started designing to when it was finally done, they had lost 16 feet of shoreline within a 2-year period. So we have 100 miles of distance that wind comes up. So if we get a heavy storm, coastal erosion is a natural process. But like with many things we're seeing now, we're seeing these natural processes that are just happening at a very unnatural rates.
Yeah.
And so living shorelines to protect coastal erosion, and it also serves multiple uses. If you want to speak in terms of ecosystem services, the erosion, but it also does water quality. It also, recharges groundwater. It attenuates the waves. It's habitat. It's social for, a lot of people like to use them recreationally, tourists. So there's checks a lot of boxes. And compared to the gray infrastructure, if you use, this is one tool as far as green infrastructure. If you compare it to the cost of gray infrastructure over the lifespan of these projects, it's often cheaper for communities to work with these green infrastructure projects, such as living shorelines, as it would be for, say, a bulkhead or a seawall. Because you put those things in, they're very effective. And sometimes I'm not against them. Sometimes there's a need because of where it's at or whatever it might be. I'm not a purist. There might be a need for that. But the day that that's finished is the strongest that is ever going to be. And it just starts degrading from there. So that's something that's not considered, is the maintenance and the upkeep and that kind of thing, where if you have the ability to institute such a green infrastructure like a living shoreline, typically from the day it's constructed, finished being built or installed, that's the weakest it's going to be. And if it's managed well, first couple of years you need higher management, but as it grows over time, it's an ecosystem. It's natural. It's a design. It's for that space. It just gets stronger and stronger. And then it also allows, as sea level does rise, it allows that marsh to migrate inland, where that gray infrastructure is not going to move. So you're going to have to rebuild it at some point.
Right. Well, let's really spend some time and go into this, because I think it's unfortunately a big part of the water conversation that is not explored, because oftentimes a lack of water is much more immediately urgent. But as you've seen in extreme events where you live, as well as what is currently happening right now in Europe with massive flooding events in Central Europe, and we can trace that back to the lost rains of the Mediterranean coast migrating up and turning into superstorms in Central and Northern Europe. It's actually flooding and inundation that is much more costly as a natural disaster and much more immediate, especially in terms of infrastructure damage, than a prolonged drought. Maybe over a longer period of time, you might see those things evening out, but they also are closely related. So let's go into, since we're already on the topic of coastal restoration and living coastlines, let's break that down and really understand what it is you're working with there. So how do you look at a coastline and determine the appropriateness for an installation like this? What are the attributes that you're looking for?
Oh, that's a very good question. So there are different methodologies of dealing with coastal erosion. And I say coastal erosion because as you deal with the permitting and that type of thing, and again, I'm speaking with U.S. specific, and it's not just in U.S. Matter of fact, the Netherlands, Australia, sometimes they're doing great work, and we're learning a lot. In the U.S., we're learning a lot from the work that they're doing there. But there are different approaches, different tools to use. So that is a very big question. I'm thinking how to articulate that and not take 45 minutes to do it. When you're looking at this, what
I'm thinking of here is
what are the sites?
Yeah, because you and I often talk about the unique observations that one can make when reading a landscape. And honestly, coastal landscapes are the areas where I probably feel the most out of water, ironically. And I wouldn't know what to look for there. So what are you observing that gives you indications as to the appropriateness or the possible interventions that could go somewhere? And feel free to take all the time you want.
Yes. Okay. So one of the main things that looking at is going out to the site. Obviously we, as in any design, using technology is great, and we do, and I'll get to that in a moment, but visiting the site and seeing what is happening and what the conditions specifically are. What is the term fetch and the distance over water that wind travels. So, because typically the drivers of coastal erosion in estuarine systems are wind waves, and there are other ones. Don't get me wrong, but whether it's boat wakes that cause the waves or the wind that cause the waves, and then also what happens in the upland coming down. So that's not a different conversation, but a different part. So addressing the waves, where are the waves coming from? What are they caused? What is the slope of the land that it's hitting? What is the slope of the underwater, the called bathymetry? What is the bathymetry in the area? What that kind of drives what interventions would be appropriate. So are the waves that are hitting the shoreline that are causing the erosion, would they be considered high energy waves because it's within a couple yards or a couple meters of a boat traffic coming through there that throws a 3-foot wake, and so it's constantly being pounded by boat wakes? And for those that aren't familiar with the term boat wake, that's the wave that's called when a boat passes. That big wave that you see coming off of that is a wake.
Well, I also want
So,
to clarify bathymetry, because if I understand it correctly, that is the topography under the water, right? So topography is on
correct.
top, that's the land, and bathymetry is like what would be under the bathwater, the under the water portion of the contours of the land there, right?
Yes, absolutely. So depending on what that slope is can kind of determine what sort of interventions you're going to need. And then looking at the different components, what is the sideshore current? So is there a lot of sediment deposition? Is this a natural process? And one of the ways of determining that, and this is where the technology comes in, you and I have had conversations about appropriate technology,
Yeah.
is, I love the ability to use low tech methods and interventions. At the same time, I do like leveraging the technology we have to determine what best interventions to make. So that's a good one where seeing what has this coast been. So looking at the satellite imagery and the aerial imagery of this coastline over the last however many, what the records show. So is this kind of a process that ebbs and flows? Is this sometimes, and we see that in some of the barrier islands, as they just move inland, and you'll see this kind of thing happen, is it disappearing? So trying to assess what is the historic context and what's happening now, and is it speeding up? Is this a process that's been happening for 100 years? And sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. A homeowner might feel like there's an erosion issue going on, but you take a look, and this might be part of the natural process, and there
Sure.
might be a few things you can do to slow it. But at the other side of it too is, what's the water doing from the upland? Is it coming off, and that erosion is actually not coming from the water side, it's coming from the upland, the stormwater runoff. And maybe what you need to do is manage the stormwater coming onto the shoreline. And then once you've determined what the context is, and for me, context is critical in every design work. So what is the appropriate strategy? And that's when you look at, you go from just a grass planting, maybe you just need to facilitate or remove what's causing any damage. It might be that the coastal erosion is occurring because somebody, there's many examples you use, but somebody did something that's causing this erosion. Well, if we just, triage this, going back to my firefighting
Yeah.
days, triage this, well, let's just stop the bleeding. If we do that, the system heals itself, the system repairs itself. Or you might be able to do some revegetation, and then you start going into the living shoreline, and then you can go, as you move along that spectrum, from green infrastructure to a hybrid option where you have a little bit of armoring, just because with the storms that are hitting there, they're more frequent, more often, more powerful, whatever that might be, or there's a lot more boat traffic, that this system will not be able to maintain what is naturally there without a little bit of gray infrastructure intervention. So you may put, maybe a little stone sill just offshore that attenuates those waves, but still allows that ecosystem ebb and flow through there without armoring the shoreline like a stone revetment or a bulkhead or a seawall would do. So it's still a natural, but now you've put a little breakwater in there just to knock the wave energy down. And then the rest of the wave energy gets dissipated by the vegetation. Two,
Mm.
sometimes if you have critical infrastructure or whatever it might be, there are times where gray infrastructure is appropriate. So deciding what intervention and along that scale, along that spectrum is the most appropriate for that, and making sure too that it's within the budget, because that's something that, the ideal world, we'd find the perfect solution and install it, but maybe if it's a homeowner or whoever it might be, may just not have the budget to that. So how do we match what they're able to do with what would be good stewardship of the landscape?
I would imagine that there's quite a cumbersome application process to work in coastal waters as well, because they're public, because they're managed by probably some overlapping jurisdictions in the United States, as they certainly are in Europe. Where do you go about navigating that process? Who do you talk to, and who okays these projects?
That is a great question. And if there was an easy answer for that, we would both
Maybe
not
more
have
work
to
like
work
this would
another
get
day.
done.
So it varies in the United States, being the structure that we have. It varies state by state. So once you get into the water side of things, the authority having jurisdiction, Army Corps of Engineers is probably part of that. Then you get into the tidal zone, and depending on where seaward versus where landward those zones end and what's public, might be state, might be local, might be a watershed board. It might be, there's any number of agencies that may be involved. But fortunately, and I'm glad you asked that, because there's a lot of states, and I'm most familiar with Maryland and Virginia, but a lot of states are trying to streamline that. So depending on what you're going to be doing, you may be able to do one application, and they've found a way on their end to kind of bring everybody to the table to get that application process as simple and easy, because they see the need for it.
Oh,
They're
nice.
on your side, as an
Yeah.
installer, designer, whoever is doing the practitioner. These agencies are on your side. They want to see the right thing done, so they'll help streamline that. So there's joint permitting applications now that are being spun up, and there's a lot of resources there. And again, I speak mainly with my knowledge being in Virginia and Maryland, but there's also quite a few states that have legislation. There's legislation that's on the board for a few other ones, but a lot of them, this is part of, even if there's not legislation, if they're coastal, this is part of their resilience planning. So they want to help you. So the easiest thing to do is engage with whatever agency may be there. It's pretty easy to find, just a Google of your state and living shoreline agency, and it'll direct you to somebody that can help you in that process. But the short answer is these processes are getting streamlined. It kind of depends on what interventions you're doing. Are you just doing planting? Are you anywhere close to a navigable channel? Because that institutes a whole different rules, and chances are they're going to suggest you look for a different option. But
Mm.
sometimes if you're very close, that might be the only one. And that will be, you have the agencies that are there to help navigate through this process. There's a lot of contractors that are well aware of it. There's a lot of NGOs that will also come out and do some of this work, whether it be helping you with the permitting process or, even the installation, grant monies and all of that. And one thing important to know too, anytime you're dealing with living shorelines, and I'll hop off my shoreline soapbox after this, but states are now making it the preferred method of dealing with coastal erosion. So
Nice.
if you have a shoreline that's eroding and you just want to put a bulkhead in because really you want a dock and that's
Yeah.
what you want, you have to show why a living shoreline would not work to prevent the erosion. So it's making it, streamlining the process for the shoreline and making it the preferred method of treatment, which is a great move. So they're not saying absolutely not to, where the gray infrastructure is needed, but you have to show where the green infrastructure is not plausible to be able to do the gray infrastructure now, which is a great step forward, in my opinion.
Absolutely. That's really encouraging to hear. Not only that they're making the process easier, but it's something that they're starting to prefer, because I know that's not the history of the management of these places. So that's really moving in the right direction. And I want to go back to another thing that you said in the beginning, which is trying to understand the longer term patterns of movement of water, of erosion, of sedimentation. within coastlines because they are working in timescales that most of us have not had the opportunity to really observe, right? It's longer than a lifespan or perhaps much longer. Where do you go about doing the investigation to figure out if the thing you are trying to address is actually an issue or part of a larger system that maybe you shouldn't intervene in or should consider how what you're trying to do can fit in with the patterns that are naturally happening?
So for the tools that to use, sometimes Google Earth, something that's I like to use open source tools because that way it's an easy way of communicating with other people. And when other people want to make these interventions, they're now able to be the advocate for this. So say you go to a homeowner that wants to do this. So you have that. Well, now when their neighbors come and talk to them about their problem, they can go and be the advocate for this intervention. So finding those historic shorelines, and then there's other tools depending where you're at. The Coastal Atlas, there's trying to think of some of the names. Virginia Institute of Marine Science has a good repository of tools and things that you can use for that. And I mentioned them. There are other ones as well, but that's the one that I find is very, very helpful. So yeah, looking at where these used to be for here, a lot of times oyster reefs, were there oyster reefs in this area? What was this area before human activity disrupted what it was? And was it human activity or was it a natural process? And there are times that for me, that is outside of my knowledge base. So that's when I reach out to one of the folks that are either in one of these NGOs or one of the government agencies, or, within a network of, within my network of friends, I have coastal engineers and that type of thing. So that might be where you bring on somebody from that specializes in that area to give their opinion, their perspective on the project, because they can do the calculations. They have that ability to really understand these systems because some of them have been doing it for decades. And so they have that knowledge, and because they focus and specialize in that area, in that type of intervention, they actually have known this landscape and have maybe already looked at that shoreline over the years because they've done a project, a mile upriver from that or whatever it might be.
Sure. Yeah, I think that is in the internet age, least valued and most useful resource is going to people who have been doing this for a long time. Oftentimes, you don't even know what questions to ask until you get the perspective of someone who's worked in the sector, has done some studies, or is keen on some aspect of the biology there that you might not even be aware of, right? I think, back to part of the technology and the AI question that we've gone over in the past, that is the biggest roadblock to using those correctly, is because they're about as smart as the prompts or the questions that you give them. And if you don't know what the prompts or the questions are to give them, you're already putting a real glass ceiling on what you can get as far as output from those types of tools. And in increasing your personal network, creating connections, friendships with people who have been doing this for a long time, to me, that's always where the biggest observations, insights, and possible paths to making really wise decisions on the landscape come from.
Absolutely, because I don't know what I don't know, and with the advent, as you mentioned, AI, leveraging that technology, and how did somebody phrase it to me the other day? The AI responses are the equivalent of having graduate students there answering your questions. So very well educated. There's some great answers, but like graduate students, even when they're wrong, they're going to answer like they're right with the utmost confidence. Not to disparage graduate students, being one myself recently. But yes, so having somebody that is able to temper that with decades of experience, decades of knowledge. Matter of fact, I'm had a conversation with a coastal engineer a few days ago, and he started doing this kind of work back when I was in elementary school. So I'm nearing 50 now. So that's been, it's been a minute. So he's probably forgotten more about, offshore current sediment deposition than I will ever know, because this has been his wheelhouse for decades. Yeah. So yes, I 100%. And that's any design work, being able to connect with specialists in that area and local knowledge.
Yes.
That's one of the things with UDI that we, indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, folks that have been in that area, having a conversation here with a gentleman that does some maintenance work in the neighborhood that I do. I've gotten to know him when I'm out walking the dog, and yeah, he and I struck up conversation, and they use the term watermen for people that have, oyster fisheries, oysters, people that have worked the water. They've used the term watermen here in the Chesapeake Bay region. It's part of the culture. And his family were watermen for years, decades, long time. And just the knowledge he has of what the oyster reefs were like and what the ecosystem was, 100 years ago, that you can't find in a book, you can't find online. But just knowing that gentleman that was out there doing some work, maintenance work on a house, chatting with him, he told me some things about the oyster populations in the Chesapeake Bay that I probably would not have found elsewhere. And just
Right.
so I use that as an example of establishing these relationships with local knowledge. And sometimes that knowledge comes from vectors that you just did not anticipate.
Absolutely. Well, so let's go into the process a little bit further now. So, depending on what you found by analyzing the site, by doing the research, by talking to local people, how do you start to assess potential interventions if you've decided that you want to do a project and it's appropriate for what you've observed?
So the first part would be I would get the stakeholders, i.e., the regulators, on board and have that conversation. Before I'd even start doing some design work, I'd have an idea in my head. Say we're going to do living shoreline. The slope is good for it. The bathymetry, that offshore topography, and then the upland topography. There's plenty of room there, and we've determined that a living shoreline, mainly planted with the appropriate species of planting, are appropriate. We kind of have an idea of, hey, this is how we would access, this is how we would do it. If we decide that there's enough wave energy that we want to put somewhat of a sill, it could be what's called an oyster castle, which is a small, concrete. There's different versions of it. There's oyster domes, oyster castles, but really what it is a structure, small structure that you can move by hand, and you can stack them to a degree, to an extent where this acts as your wave attenuation for the heavier waves, and then the vegetation that's just up inland of that, those marsh grasses, attenuate the rest of the waves to prevent erosion. And it provides these oyster castles or habitat for oysters. They tend to colonize them, and that really makes the system, locks it together, and you're providing a habitat for these oysters that had been washed away. So that's kind of our plan, but we want to make sure that, hey, is this a viable option? So that's where we get the regulators, have a conversation with them, hopefully get them out to the site, say, this is what we're thinking. What are your thoughts? And they will tell us, hey, you need to think about this, or this will require this type of permit versus that type of permit. You'll have to get this kind of approval with that. Or they may say, hey, because you're so close to a navigable waterway, and that may slow things down or make engineering, or you have to change it. They'll notify us if there's any areas that we don't see, any blind spots that might trip up the program, or if we're good to go. Then we apply for it, do our design work, do the application, and then as it's passes through that process, gets approved for us, because I'm involved with installation, but I don't specifically do the whole turnkey installation work. Then we find have a conversation with contractors, find the appropriate contractor, work with them, make sure that our plan and our budget is what they see, because they're familiar with, hey, there's been a 20% increase in sand price over the last year, so you've got to bump that budget up. So having that conversation, and then once everything's ready to go, establishing the timeline, and then it's the herding cats that goes with project management, because you may have volunteer work available, but then you got to schedulings can be a challenge, because volunteers are only available sometimes on weekends. And then you got to hit a weekend if you're placing oyster castles with low tide, and to make sure that you can get out there in that area. So these are all components, but it's that chess game of figuring out project management, which all project managers out there will be like, man, that's an easy example there. You should hear my story.
I'm sure. So what we've talked about as far as examples now are revegetating with coastal grasses, using these oyster shells, and basically what it is, it's adding friction into the water, right? To reduce the kinetic energy and hopefully detain some of the erosion. What are some of the other options that you've seen out there that can be effective in this space?
Right. And one thing I do want to mention just before we move on to your question is also providing, and I didn't really mention this, is providing the upland routes for this shoreline to migrate as sea level rises too. And if you are doing any hard infrastructure like the oyster castles, that type of thing, are you building it at a level that it becomes obsolete within 30 years because the waves are just now over
Right.
top of it and it doesn't make any difference? But you don't want to go too high because then you don't want to disconnect one ecosystem from the other, although you leave gaps, and there's, not to get in the weeds on that. So other interventions, and that's really good you bring up because these are appropriate where we're at. So the Carolinas up into this area, oyster castles, there's some really interesting things being developed by different companies with like Natrix and that kind of thing, where they're doing basalt bags. So the oyster bags is one of the things that they'll use for structure. But the problem is it's a plastic bag. So what happens as that plastic deteriorates? Well, they're developing one using natural materials. Core logs is another one. And again, that's kind of a intervention until the grasses take over because those will deteriorate, biodegrade. They're manufacturing, like they can actually manufacture, what's the word I'm looking for? They can manufacture on demand sort of whatever type of structure that you might need. So there's a project, I was talking with the one manufacturer some weeks ago, and they had a project in Hawaii where the keystone species in the ecosystem where they were working was a type of crab, but the habitat had been damaged for the crab. So that's why the crab population had dropped. So they were able to manufacture these structures that would not only attenuate waves, but they called them crabitats, where the crabs now had a home to go that was going to last. So but then as you move into the tropics, you're looking, potentially at mangroves. So this is another one I'm a big fan of. I don't know as much about yet. Learning more and more about, but mangrove systems are huge, especially in those areas where you have the big storms. The amount of storm damage that can be attenuated by a mangrove forest is amazing. Why, I'm glad to see places adopting this as their approach because they're realizing, well, there are so many benefits, not just to protection of the coastline and protection of the gray infrastructure, but the economic return of having that as social capital where people want to come spend time in those natural areas, but also the economic return on the nurseries for fisheries and that type of thing, which sustains part of their economic area where they're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And tell me about some of the projects that you've participated in now, the process and the things that you've observed from seeing one of these projects through as a participant, right? I know you haven't been running all of these. You've been learning a lot, especially in the last couple of years. What have you learned from these experiences so far?
One is that when the living shoreline's installed, it's kind of like it's a garden. So gardens need tending. And that's one of the misconceptions that some people have. And that for those first few years, it's an ecosystem, so it's going to self-organize. And once it self-organizes, like after those first few years, they say kind of think of it as a child. When it's early on, it's kind of like a toddler, needs a little more attention, and then it grows quickly to the point where after anywhere from 2 to 5 years, then it's sort of established. So it's going to move around, it's going to do its own thing, and it's going to self-organize, sometimes in ways that you don't expect. So being part of the design side of it was cool. And all right, how do we anticipate not only what's here, but what the future conditions might be, and how do we plan for that? And then coming into shoreline projects that have already been installed. And one that I looked at, I had the opportunity to chat with one of the managers, and I noticed that, so they had installed the what looked like a textbook living shoreline in this area, and there is no textbook living shoreline for those out there listening that know something about this and are now losing their minds. I apologize for that oversimplification. But the living shorelines you see in a lot of images where you have, the spatins, different species of grasses as you move inland. And over 2 years, I've saw where it's almost started to create a dune system because there was so much wind. I mean, there was over 100 miles, or right around 100 miles of distance over water that was unobstructed by any land. So long way for that wind. So that wind would blow the sand upland and actually started creating a dune system, which was really, really cool because this project, the goal was erosion protection. That was the project that I had mentioned that it had lost 16 foot of shoreline. So it accomplished that. And it's actually seen what's called accretion, which is sediment accrual in the grasslands, which needs to happen as sea level rises. It's great. Keep sediment out of the bay. That's one win. Builds up this salt marsh as sea levels rise. It's going to need to do that. That's another win. And it's attenuating those waves so much that during the storms that have come up, it's dropping out that sediment. So those grasses are attenuating enough of the energy of the waves that it's dropping sediment out. So that's another win. But I was kind of curious, it was kind of neat to see where it was designed to be this kind of gradual sloping living shorelines, not to anthropomorphize Mother Nature, but Mother Nature said, nah, this is more of a dune system here. So, which brings up the subject of adaptive management. All right. So how do we had this plan, and we thought, it was going to go this way. And nature said, nope, I'm going this way. Okay. Well, it's still accomplishing what the intention was, and that was to stop the erosion. How now can we facilitate this developing into the system it wants to be? Again, not to anthropomorphize, but this wants to be somewhat of a dune system, somewhat of a living shoreline. And there's a lot of overlap, not to split hairs in semantics, but how do we facilitate that? So observing, monitoring this, and recognizing this is the direction it's going, that's a good thing. How do we make it better?
I love that. That's such a good example of adaptive management. And I'm curious what, obviously setting out the goal to reduce erosion, if not actually start to build back up the shoreline, was a big part of it. What are the other things that you measure for in this and make sure that you look out for? Because like you said, there can be many unintended consequences, both good and bad, that if you're not familiar with what you're looking for, can reduce the efficacy of the adaptive management that can come later. What are the things that you're measuring, that you're looking out for, that could happen from an installation like this?
Oh, yes. Great question, because that starts very early on in the design process. So if we do this here, what is that going to cause down the coastline? So in the neighboring adjacent properties, have we reduced erosion here just to move it down there, and maybe exacerbated down there?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things, designing to make sure. And that's where people that are far more knowledgeable than I am coming into these, that if we're, if it's one thing, if you're reestablishing what was already there just because there was some kind of damage done, and now you're, as I mentioned, the triage, you're doing the triage, removing the bleeding, letting it heal, great, and it's going to be just completely natural. But if you're doing any kind of breakwater or that type of thing, where now you're changing the offshore current, the offshore dynamic of that, are you moving a problem downstream, whether that be erosion, or maybe that downstream area was part of sediment accrual, and maybe that's where sediment deposition happened. You want to make sure you don't do anything to take that away. And then as the project goes through, managing, as you typically would with many projects, as you're doing installation, making sure that whatever disruption you're causing, especially if you're moving equipment, not doing any damage, for the first, do no harm. So as you're coming through, how are you planning your access? How are you planning to move materials? How are you planning, if you need any heavier equipment, how are they coming in? Because you don't want to do damage to what's already there, or the upland, forest. And for us, it's often forest. And then after it's installed, where's that sediment going to go? Do you need to control for any kind of, do you need to do any kind of intervention with any damage you might have done? So now the shoreline's in place. how's the vegetation responding? Do we need to do replanting? Do we need to change our planting program and cycle? Because, like I said, with the dune system, some of this shoreline, the plants took off. Other places, it got buried. So, needing to come back and say, hey, we don't want the entire sand, the dune, to move inland into the forest. So, as it's building up here, do we want to put a little structure in here? Or do we want to maybe revegetate this area that has moved inland and buried what plant material was there so it can stabilize what is now a really small dune and keep it from just completely, then doing the damage, migrating to a point where you don't want it. How
Yeah,
else
that
might
also
that?
begs the question of like how broadly are you observing your site, right? Because it can have unintended effects way further down when you're dealing with these types of large forces.
Right. And that's one of the, for this one, it's kind of neat because it's also part of a state park system. So having that advertised that this is what they've done, but also using citizen science in this case is great, because then you can, have folks put that, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the term, but kind of plan a post and say, hey, take a picture here and share it to this page, because
Oh
then you
yeah,
can
photo
actually
referencing.
see.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, so having that photo record of how the shoreline is shifting, changing, that kind of thing, and you can identify if there's any spots that are becoming problem areas. Say we have a hurricane move up the bay. Obviously you'll want to go out or have somebody go out if any major event, but all to monitor post major event, but also have a monitoring schedule. And I was chatting with the shoreline contractor recently, and he compares it to having a child. And so he has that conversation with a homeowner or a landowner or a land manager when they do a shoreline installation, where they'll talk and say, now this is us having a child together. So even if you and I get divorced, I'm not going to ignore this child. Neither are you. So,
it's a good
as
way of
we,
putting it.
yeah. So I'm going to be available to you to reach out, because this will need to be monitored as an adjuster. And over the first year, there's going to be, some things that aren't expected. It's going to change. It's going to do that. And we want to keep a closer eye on it. And then as, after a year or two, it starts kind of settling out. Okay, this is what it's looking like, but there will still be that, availability to reach out, the monitoring, and seeing if there's any update, upkeep, maintenance that needs done to that. And then after it's, been around for 5 years, okay, now it's kind of out of college and off into the working world, or out of high school and off into the working world. Okay, so now we check in every once in a while, but we don't have to be intervening, and it's day to day. So as that shoreline goes, and then it gets very much stronger. But monitoring and adaptive management is a very, very key component, like many ecosystem restoration projects, in making sure it's successful.
I really like that analogy that you used, and I actually want to go back a little bit to what you were talking about before, which is the floodwater management and how that can affect the coastal ecosystems. Obviously, there can be a lot of erosion from that side as well, but what are some of the considerations from floods on the landscape and other, let's say, causes of pollution or contamination that need to be taken into consideration when you're designing something on a coastline?
Yes, that is one of the main, and that one that I glanced over because I talked a lot from the waterside inland, but coming from the upland down, a lot of times, and some contractors I've spoken with have said, that's sometimes 50% of the projects that they look at.
Yeah,
The shoreline's not the problem. It's the upland runoff that's
right.
causing the issue. So as we would intervene in a lot of other places, and it's very context specific. So, that whole, well, it depends being the horrible answer for anybody doing an interview, but it kind of depends. That being said, I can generalize in terms of, we would take the same approaches that we often take in any upland environment, that we want to slow down. I think it was Brock Dolman, the slow, soak it in, spread it out, soak it in. So being able to do that with the runoff, this time, maybe it's not necessarily because we need to store that runoff for future use, but we don't want that runoff to do damage. So the analogy I use here, because folks here are very familiar with COVID, and we want to flatten the curve, right? That was
Yeah,
the goal for a lot of the interventions for COVID, because we would see the big spike, and my wife actually works in a hospital, and it was a problem. So it wasn't that we're trying to prevent everybody from getting COVID. That's not possible. We just want to spread out the that patient load over a period of time so we can handle it. Same
Right.
thing we're doing with stormwater. We want to flatten the curve, so we don't want that sharp spike, because we have so much impervious cover in this area. And by impervious cover, I mean things like, parking lots paved over, roofs, hardscapes, all these things that water hits and just runs off. It doesn't hold it on that. It doesn't soak in. It just runs off straight into the waterway, or straight into whatever avenue that water is going to take until it
Or
gets to the
storm drain
tidal area.
infrastructure and such. Yeah.
Right. So how do we hold that water on the landscape, try to get it, hold it, stop it, slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in? How do we do that? So, rainscapes, as we see with a lot of stormwater BMP's best management practices, downspout disconnects, rain gardens for the smaller scale properties, infiltration basins, that type of thing, constructed wetlands before it hits this. We're still doing that on these properties. Are there ways that we can, on the property or whatever property is upland of the property we're dealing with, can we make interventions there? And that's where stakeholder engagement is, once again, huge, because you want to talk to the neighbors. Matter of fact, side note about living shorelines in Virginia requires you to have a letter from your neighbors saying, hey, you're aware of this is going on, and do you approve, do you not, whatever. But you're actually forced to do that as part of the permitting process.
That makes me wonder about how many people in the United States that deters just from the idea that they have to go and talk to their neighbors.
That is a good point. Maybe they don't advertise that part until you're already partway through and you've hired a designer, and they're like, oh, by the way, but wait, there's more. And, it doesn't necessarily, you need approval, but you have to at least engage with them.
Right.
But that might be like here, where what's your upland? Where's that water coming from? Is there a way to have a conversation with that land manager to do that? And then finding the appropriate BMP or intervention that handles, is that volume that you're worried about? Is it the speed at which it's coming that you're worried about? Is it the pollutant load that you're worried that it's coming about? Is it all the above? What intervention can I make that addresses the need on this property and the problem / resource that's coming in off that property? Is there something that I can do with that makes it a resource, or at the very least does keep it from doing damage?
Yeah, for sure. And so, having participated in a couple of these now, where do you see the potential being? I mean, I know that the difficulty is understanding what the upper limits on something like this are. And this is where I go back to the importance of speaking with people with a lot more experience who have seen things, perhaps even before they were severely degraded. That idea of baseline reset syndrome. Are you restoring to a degraded state because you have no reference to a higher state of health? Give me an idea about what you see as the potential of maybe broad application of this kind of stuff, or at least reduction of the farm that is degrading it in the first place. Where could this potentially end up? What could healthy coastlines look like?
That's a very good question, and a very challenging one because of sea level rise. And again, we're seeing it here, where I'm trying to think now, and I was actually considering that earlier today. We've had coastal flood advisories every day for the last, I don't know how many days, but and the neighbors here that aren't necessarily looking at the world through an ecological lens like a designer might are saying, hey, we're noticing that this is a really big problem. So how do we address that, and what role does either living shorelines, mangrove forest, dune systems, all of these natural systems play? And it can be a tough one to answer, because it means we have to change the way we do, not just the way we do business, but understanding that, certain areas that historically have been stable and maybe the occasional flood are now going to be often underwater. Do we need to migrate our built environment away from that and allow it to be a natural environment from here on out? With living shorelines, where we start now, and I mentioned the oyster castles or whatever I'd mentioned before as a sill, kind of that wave attenuation. How long until that's underwater? And then where does this shoreline, where does this salt marsh, where does this mangrove forest need to migrate to maintain this ecosystem? to restore it to its natural state? Yeah, that's a very good question. And, to not go too deep philosophically into the weeds, well, what's the natural state too? Is
Right.
that pre-climate change? Is that pre-colonialism? Is that pre-human intervention? Because those are all different states. Pre-industrialization, there you could have steps. And what does it look like? Where are we going back to? And that's a challenge. And that's where, just with the green infrastructure, such as a living shoreline or any ecological design project or restoration project, that's where the context is okay, who are the stakeholders? Who are the ones that are actually going to manage or maintain or be responsible for this after we may step away? Not that we break contact, but is this property, is it managed by the government? Is it a nonprofit? Is it a private owner? And what is their capacity? What are the resources? What are their plans? Are they putting it into a conservation easement, or could it be sold next month and go to somebody that's, nope, I want to put a boat dock in? And then understanding, and this is, as I was actually chatting with a gentleman earlier today about modeling what some of these changes look like over time as the storms come up. How do we plan for these events? Maybe do we not necessarily plan to capture all of it, but survive it? So
Right.
we plan for the 10-year storm event, but now these 100-year storm events that are happening, hey, there's that 1% chance of that happening this year is now going up to 12%. We need to build this, not that we're intending to handle and manage that much water, but at least survive it without getting washed out, like we're seeing Central Europe, like we saw in the states of Pennsylvania and New York earlier this year in the U.S., just devastation. So understanding the principles and the processes that are occurring, what that looks like, how that, how quickly does the shoreline accrue material? So will it rise with, or will it get submerged? Will it have time to migrate? These are all things that working with multiple disciplinary teams are huge. Bringing on board these folks that have this information, expertise, knowledge, or the ability to get it, as opposed to trying to be the master of so many domains, being the one that, okay, hey, I need somebody that knows about coastal morphology, along with somebody that knows about GIS and watershed planning, and then somebody that knows about stormwater permitting, because that's part of it. And okay, how do we manage this? And finally kind of coming together as a community, which we're seeing here. I'm in an area of Southern Maryland. This county is putting significant money into grants for community supported programs. So getting together as a community, as opposed to just single individual property owners, which is great. I don't discourage that. But if you can get the community together to come up with some of these, one, it saves a lot of money or aggregated over the community. But two, now you have a system-wide, ecosystem-wide, community-wide intervention plan response to all these things, that as you plan with this community, how do we all respond to this? Where does it take it? And what can we all do aggregated over our individual land ownership to make a difference in this? So I don't know if I actually answered that question. I used a lot of words, maybe not answered it, but did I cover that, or is there a little more
I think
detail
that's one of the
like
better answers that I've heard in a while, because it is such a difficult thing to project onto a landscape what you think its potential is, and is obviously an ongoing process of discovery, because there are things that you cannot predict. There are emergent properties that are going to need to be adapted to, as we talked about in the short term of monitoring and maintaining projects. And we have collectively no reference to really what a healthy, vibrant state is, at least not in most living memory. And I mean, goodness knows our photo records don't go back that far. But along that line, that's also what I have been talking about increasingly with the holistic water management plans that I'm promoting in the farmer network. And a lot of my clients are obviously agriculturalists. The idea that there is a real limit to what you can accomplish working within your own property boundaries, and that the real potential is when you start to come together, especially when it comes to working with something like water, which doesn't have boundaries and is such an amalgamous and communal resource that, until we start to look at this at watershed scales, until we start to look up and down the the whole movement zone of this as an element and as a resource, it's all pretty small interventions, right? You're never really going to have an effect on things like water cycle and rainfall patterns if you're working within a single farm. And farms are some of the largest estates that we can think to do this on, right? So even much more limited when you're working on a single property in an urban or a suburban environment. And yeah, it's something that I'm really keen to continue to explore. And as we're talking about things to kind of take beyond this and continue to explore, I really wanted to make sure that we made time in this conversation for my favorite part of many of our discussions, which is up until now, we've kind of been going over patterns, processes, and overview of these different topics that we've explored. What are you nerding out about these days? What are the rabbit holes that you're going into? Because I always find gold when I ask this question of you.
That's a great. I'm glad you didn't ask this at the beginning. Otherwise, I probably would have talked about it the whole time. So a few things. One being, I try to approach, and this ties in our conversation with this next part, is try to approach most of the things, not just from a point of observation, but first principles, understanding patterns, understanding processes. What are the underlying principles to all these things? And like you mentioned with, or what are we restoring it to? Do these processes or patterns even exist on this landscape anymore? If we're trying to take it back 50 years, but the rainfall is different, we're not going to be able to do that.
Sure.
And it's not appropriate to do that. So one of the things is learning from people. I am a big nerd on, and I'm very, very fortunate where there's a lot of people and the gatekeepers to information that have kind of gone away. So following some of the folks that are, really, really good at what they do. Recently, I've taken, get ready for the plug, Water Stories and Intensive with Zach Weiss, and which is great. I love that. So there's another PSKL Water for All, Ali bin Shihad, that does a lot of papers on, sorry, I started 3 sentences there and haven't finished any of them. Folks like Alpha Low, Ali, these guys these folks that have, Judy Schwartz, that have done the research and come up, Milan, have done this research and really nerding out on, okay, taking that knowledge and saying, okay, how can we do it? Where can we apply that knowledge to the space that I work in? So they've kind of done that hard work, the heavy lifting of that. I'll use the term first principles, but whatever term you might like, permaculture principles, first principles, ecological principles, these are the baseline of what's driving it, these processes. So, okay, how do we take that knowledge and apply it here to leverage that to make the interventions and the change that we would like to see on the landscape? So there is that process. And the other side is, like I mentioned earlier on, I like low-tech interventions because it's not resource intensive, it's not energy intensive. Well, it can be energy intensive, but that can be human energy. It doesn't require necessarily infrastructure and these kind of things. It can be applied anywhere by anyone. So it's the barrier to entry for these are easily accessible. If they fail, small interventions kind of fractally applied across a landscape do a great amount of work with a low amount of risk, with a low amount of initial, especially capital investment. So
Right.
It makes it very attractive on many fronts, and they're very hardy. They don't require technology to maintain them. That being said, I also kind of nerd out on where technology is now that I'm, about to turn 50, and I know the general thought is anything that's invented after you turn 40 is automatically evil. I don't necessarily disagree. However, AI is something that I'm very interested in. And don't get me wrong, I am very well aware that there are many problems with AI. There's, heavy energy usage. There's, the ethical considerations of how might this be used, the safety concerns, but also, we just saw in Memphis where they're installing a big, huge AI center that the community wasn't really even consulted on. It just kind of got forced through. And I think it uses so much energy to power 100 to 150,000 homes. It's a lot. So
Wow.
There are downside. And I'm not saying AI is but it's here and it is a tool like any technology. So as it's here, how could it be leveraged for good? Just like, fossil fuel can be damaging, but you can use an excavator to do some really good land management stuff if appropriate. So one of the things I'm nerding out on, and sorry, this is why I use 5 words when 50 will do, to answer your question, is I'm kind of nerding out on how people are leveraging AI to restore ecosystems, to benefit to heal ecology. Because these ecosystems don't necessarily have to be natural systems. A farm's an ecosystem, your yard's an ecosystem. So how are people leveraging AI to do this? Because there have been an incredible amount of leverage with some of these processes. And I'll use the example of wetland delineation. I think it was NOAA, but I might be wrong on that developed an AI program. Now, it still had to be ground truth, but the accuracy was very, very high, pretty much right out of the gate. And the time, energy, money it took to do that. Now, like I said, it still had to have a human team ground truth it, but hours as opposed to weeks. So if this tool can be utilized in a proper, appropriate, conscious way, that we can start restoring the ecosystem processes, these ecological processes that we rely on, that our world relies on, that's really where I'm really interested and kind of nerding out on that right now. So for you listeners, if you have those things, I'd love to hear about it.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we'll make sure that we give them your contact. In fact, I'll throw that to you right now. And that really primes the pump for our next conversation. I think I would love to go further into that, maybe even invite some other people to shed some perspective, a lot beyond, this is not an area of expertise of mine by any means, and understanding the potential, but also the boundaries, some considerations for appropriate use. There's so much to unpack there. I really appreciate you bringing that up. So before we wrap up, Mike, can you give our listeners your contact information, how they can reach out to you and learn more about what you do?
Absolutely. My email, easternecosystems.com. So it's Mike at easternecosystems.com. And then I'm also part of United Designers International. There's a lot of us under that umbrella, so I'm pretty easy to find there. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a fledgling YouTube thing that I'm toying with, because one of the things we did not get to today is education and water management that I'm really interested in to supplement what's already out there. But so I'm tinkering with that. But yeah, LinkedIn's a place, like if you're on social, that's the easiest social to find me at. But yeah, my email, website, whatever that might be, I'm pretty accessible.
Fantastic.
And UDI. Yeah.
I really appreciate you taking the time for this discussion. It was really cool to have it recorded and be able to share some of your insights and some of the incredible things that you've been learning and participating in. And I look forward to doing this again real soon.
Likewise, and not to go all fanboy here, but I really appreciate, one, the invitation and allowing me to speak, but also the work you do and getting the message out there, not just the work you do with the podcast, which is fantastic, but also the work you do outside of here, with your work with climate farms and everything. Anyway, I really appreciate all the work you do and everything every effort you're making there. So thank you.
Thanks so much, buddy. All right. Well, look, let's wrap that up for today, and we'll catch up again real soon.
Sounds great. This has been fun. Thank you.
Now, before we wrap this up, just remember that these episodes are only the beginning of the learning resources, design and coaching services, in-person courses, and interactive community that are available through Regenerative Skills. The Discord server is our free community where you can connect with other like-minded listeners, exchange ideas, stories, tips, and resources, as well as interact with me directly and quite a few former guests from the show. Our Instagram account @regen_skills is the best place to see the projects that me and the team are working on, both for clients and collaborators, as well as on our own properties. I'll also be announcing the certification courses, workshops, and gatherings that we've got coming up later this year. If you're interested in getting dedicated support for your own project, you can now schedule a free planning session with one of our team members through the request form on our website. You can also find all the links, show notes, and past resources there at regenerativeskills.com. We truly believe that no matter your experience, your knowledge, abilities, resources, or background, you can be a powerful force for regeneration on this planet, and we're here to help you find your path. So as always, remember to keep taking those little steps every day towards a regenerative future, and I'll be right by your side along the way.